He left me for a family I couldn't give. I still remember the way he looked at me when the doctor told us. Empty. Like he was already halfway out the door. We were sitting in the sterile white room, the air thick with quiet that didn't feel respectful, just suffocating. The doctor said the words gently, as if cushioning a blow I'd already felt coming. I'm sorry. Based on the results, it's highly unlikely you'll be able to conceive naturally. My breath caught. Not because I didn't know, but because he didn't. And I was hoping he would take my hand. But instead he sat back, eyes blank, lips pressed tight. And all I could think was, say something, please. Just say anything that sounds like love. He didn't. Not then. Not when we walked to the car in silence. Not when we drove home with the radio off and our hearts louder than ever. And not when we lay side by side in bed, miles apart beneath the same blanket. His name was Ryan. We'd been together 5 years, talked about baby names, painted the extra bedroom sage green, argued over whether Eli or Noah sounded stronger. He told me once, "You'll be the best mom, I can feel it." But feelings fade. Especially when biology speaks louder. A month later, he left. No dramatic fight, no slammed doors, just a folded note on the kitchen table. I want a family. I hope someday you understand. I can't pretend this doesn't matter. And just like that, the man I thought would fight for me walked away. I shattered in private. I deleted baby name lists, repainted the nursery gray, stopped looking at families in the park, stopped visiting my sister, who had just had twins, because it wasn't just about losing Ryan. It was about losing the idea of myself I thought I was allowed to become. I spent years trying to find footing again. Therapy, journaling, yoga I hated. But nothing healed me quite like the moment I sat in a quiet courtroom and signed the paperwork that said, foster parent, approved. It was ironic, really. The one thing I thought I'd never be, a mother, was now something I could choose. Not through biology, not through love at first sight, but through resilience, through saying yes to children who had only heard no. And I did. Over the years, I welcomed child after child. Some stayed weeks, some stayed months, some left a mark, some broke my heart. But each one reminded me, love doesn't come from your womb. It comes from your willingness to stay. Then, one Tuesday in November, I got a call. "We've got a 7-year-old girl in need of short-term placement," the voice said. "She's quiet, traumatized, was removed from a single father who's under investigation." I said yes. Of course I said yes. I always said yes. What I didn't know was that when that little girl walked through my front door, clutching a backpack with a broken zipper, I would see eyes I'd seen before. Eyes that belonged to the man who left me because I couldn't give him a child. Years later, I chose to become a foster mom. It took me a long time to reclaim the word mother, longer still to believe I had the right to. Because after Ryan left, every baby I passed in the supermarket, every Mother's Day ad, every ultrasound photo on someone else's fridge, felt like a blade to the ribs. At first, I avoided children entirely. Birthday parties, playgrounds, even my best friend's baby shower. I skipped it and said I was sick. But grief doesn't shrink when you ignore it. It grows in silence, and it wraps itself around your identity until you no longer recognize your own reflection. I didn't wake up one day and decide to become a foster parent. It wasn't that clean. It started small, helping a neighbor watch their toddler, reading bedtime stories at the local shelter. And then one day, a boy named Mateo grabbed my hand at the library and asked, "Are you a mom?" I said no. He looked confused. "But you sound like one." That night I cried, harder than I had in years, because in one innocent sentence, a child saw in me something I had buried, the capacity to love. I began to research, attended a foster care information session, filled out forms, underwent background checks, home inspections, interviews. They asked hard questions. Can you let go when they leave? Can you handle children with trauma? Can you love without expectation? I didn't know the answers, but I said yes anyway. 6 months later, I got the call. "We have a little boy who needs emergency placement." His name was Aaron. 4 years old, wouldn't speak, wouldn't make eye contact. He came with one tattered blanket and a stuffed bear missing an eye. I made him macaroni and cheese. He didn't eat. I left the light on in the hallway. He still screamed through the night. But the third morning, he brought me the bear and placed it in my lap. That was the first "I trust you" I'd heard in a long time. Aaron stayed 3 months. When he left, I broke down. I swore I couldn't do it again. But then and again, and again. Each child chipped away at the part of me that believed I was broken, unworthy, less than. Each good night, each hug, each tiny hand in mine stitched something back together. I wasn't there forever, but I was their safe place for a while. And in that, I found something Ryan never gave me: purpose. Then came that Tuesday in November. I was asked to take in a 7-year-old girl. Short term, emergency placement, removed from her father. Quiet, distant, but no behavioral issues. I said yes. I always did. When she arrived, her social worker stood beside her on my front step. She was tiny, wearing a hoodie 2 sizes too big, her hair tied in a messy ponytail. She didn't look at me, just clutched her backpack like it was the only home she had. "Hi," I said gently. "I'm glad you're here." No response. Just a blink. She stepped inside without a word. I offered snacks, blankets, a tour of the house. Still nothing. Until I showed her the spare bedroom. Her bedroom. And she whispered, "Can I sleep with the door closed?" I paused. "Of course, whatever makes you feel safe." She nodded. That night, I sat on the couch, exhausted, but something tugged at my thoughts. Her eyes. Familiar. Too familiar. And then it hit me. I ran to the file folder I kept for every child, flipped through intake documents, looked at the last name, and froze. Taylor. My chest tightened. I turned to the next page. Father, Ryan Taylor. Date of birth, 1986. Emergency contact? None. I couldn't breathe. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew. The child asleep in my guest room, the girl who asked to sleep with the door shut because trust was too dangerous, was the daughter of the man who once left me because he believed I could never be a mother. The child who walked in looked familiar. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? She was just a child, curled up in the twin bed down the hall, wrapped in a pink blanket, bunny tucked under her arm. And yet every time I closed my eyes, his face appeared. Ryan, the man who once looked at me with such longing, then turned that longing into a weapon when I couldn't give him what he wanted most. And now fate had dragged his child into my home, into my arms, into the place where he once said I didn't belong. At 6:30 a.m., I made oatmeal, added cinnamon like my mother used to, placed a small bowl on the table. A minute later, I heard soft footsteps. She walked in slowly, still rubbing her eyes. "Good morning," I said gently. She gave a tiny nod, sat, stared at the oatmeal, then whispered, "It smells like something I forgot." My heart clenched. "It's okay," I said. "You don't have to eat it." She looked at me. "I want to. It just feels weird when something is nice." I said nothing. What could I say to a child who already believed kindness was suspicious? After breakfast, I watched her from the hallway. She found the bookshelf, ran her fingers along the spines, picked out Charlotte's Web. I smiled. It was my favorite growing up. She didn't speak again until lunch. Then, out of nowhere, she asked, "What do you do if your dad stops calling you?" I froze. "Did he used to call you often?" She shrugged. "Sometimes, not lately. His girlfriend doesn't like me." I sat down beside her. "That's not your fault." "I know," she said, but she didn't believe it. I could see it in her eyes. Later that day, while she napped, I pulled out the intake folder again. I studied every line, and though I already knew, my heart needed confirmation. Ryan Taylor. Emergency removal due to neglect. Mother unknown. Sole custody granted to father 3 years ago. This was real. She was his. I walked into the guest room. She was still asleep, brow furrowed, arms gripping her bunny like a life raft. She looked so small, so breakable. And in that moment, something inside me cracked open. Not anger, not resentment. Just grief. Grief for her. Grief for the version of me that Ryan never let exist. She stirred. Eyes fluttered open, saw me, and whispered, "Did I do something wrong?" I knelt beside the bed. "No, sweetheart, you're perfect." "Then why does everyone keep leaving me?" Tears sprang to my eyes. I took her hand. "I don't have all the answers," I whispered, "but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." She stared at me for a long time. Then slowly, she nodded and pulled my hand to her cheek. That night, I sat on the porch, phone in hand, tempted, terrified. Finally, I typed the number I hadn't dialed in nearly 7 years. Ryan's. I hit call. It rang twice. Then his voice. "Hello?" Silence. Then, "Clara?" My voice shook. "You have a daughter, and she's in my house." I found out who her father was. "You have a daughter, and she's in my house." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long, I thought he'd hung up. Then finally, "Clara?" "Yes. Wait, what do you mean, my daughter's there?" I forced my voice to stay steady. "Social services placed her with me, emergency foster care." That's not possible." "Is her name Mia?" "Yes," he whispered. "Then it's possible." There was a pause, and then a shift. He tried to sound in control. "Look, I didn't know you were involved. I'll call them. I'll get her back." I laughed. A cold, bitter sound I didn't recognize as my own. "You think this is about you getting her back?" "She's my daughter, Clara." "And where have you been, Ryan?" Because this little girl hasn't heard your voice in weeks. She asked me why her dad stopped calling. She thinks it's her fault. Silence. Then softer. It's not what you think. It never is it? We hung up without resolution. But I knew one thing for sure. He was going to show up. And I had to be ready. 2 days later, he did. Standing on my porch in the same posture I remembered from years ago. Arrogance barely hiding the guilt. He held a bouquet of cheap flowers. I didn't open the screen door. You're not here to charm me, Ryan. It's for Mia. She's at school. Bowl. And no, you can't wait inside. He blinked. So this is who you are now? No, this is who I always was. You just didn't stay long enough to see it. He looked away. The silence between us carried more weight than any accusation ever could. Why didn't you tell me you were fostering? He asked finally. Because you forfeited the right to know anything about my life the day you walked out because I couldn't give you a child. That's not fair. What's not fair is your daughter being passed around like luggage while you try to play dad when it's convenient. His face hardened, but he said nothing, because he knew I was right. I didn't plan for this, he muttered. Neither did she. I crossed my arms. Let me ask you something, Ryan. If you knew it was me, would you still have let her walk into this house? Into the arms of a woman you once told could never be a real mom? He opened his mouth, closed it. I didn't know how to be a father, he finally admitted. Her mom left. I panicked. I did the best I could. No, you did what was easiest, just like you did with me. Tears welled in his eyes. Unfamiliar, raw. Is she okay? I hesitated, then answered truthfully. She's scared. She's quiet, but she's safe. She eats her food, she sleeps with the door shut. She read Charlotte's Web twice this week. His eyes softened. She always liked stories about animals. I looked at him, really looked. He wasn't the man I remembered. Time had added lines to his face, but not maturity to his soul. Ryan, I said, this little girl, she needs consistency, stability, not another promise waiting to be broken. He nodded, then whispered. She asked about me? She asked why you stopped calling. That broke him. He sat on the porch step, head in hands. I didn't know how to talk to her without lying. So you chose silence? Yeah, he said. And now I don't know how to fix it. For a long moment, we just sat there. The past between us like glass, shattered, sharp, impossible to walk on without bleeding. She doesn't need you to fix it, I said quietly. She needs you to show up, even if it's uncomfortable, even if you're afraid. He looked up at me. Are you going to keep her? As long as she wants me to, I said. As long as the system lets me, and as long as she doesn't have anyone else who can love her better. He looked away again and whispered, I don't know if I'm that person anymore. I stood. Then don't take her back just because you're trying to make peace with yourself. That night, Mia came home. She found the flowers on the kitchen table. Who are these from? Someone from your past, I said. But they're yours now. If you want them. She nodded, touched a petal, then smiled. Just barely. They smell nice. He kept knocking, but not for her. Ryan came back the next week. Not with custody papers, not with lawyers, not even with a clear purpose. He just showed up, holding a manila envelope, wearing the same guilt-wrapped mask he'd had on for years. I opened the door. What do you want, Ryan? He looked tired. To talk, just talk. I hesitated, then stepped aside. 10 minutes. He sat on the edge of the couch like he was afraid to touch anything. I stood, arms crossed, wall back up. Mia's not here, I said. She's at a library event. He nodded. I didn't come for her. My heart stung. How could he say that so easily? Then why are you here? He placed the envelope on the coffee table. It's a release form. I'm signing over my parental rights. I blinked. What? I talked to her caseworker. I asked about long-term placement options. She told me the best thing I could do, if I wasn't going to step up, was let go. He exhaled. So I'm letting go. I stared at him, trying to understand the emotion inside me. Was it relief? Anger? Grief? Or maybe something worse? You don't even want to try? Clara, he said, voice low. I'm not fit to raise her. I've messed up too much. I'm not stable. You are. I walked closer, looked him in the eye. Are you doing this for her or to avoid the guilt? He didn't answer. But he didn't need to. I knew. She still asks about you, you know, I said softly. She wonders what she did wrong. That broke him again. He looked away, wiping his eyes roughly. Please tell her I didn't stop loving her. I just didn't know how to love right. My voice cracked. You didn't know how to love me either. He looked up. I know. For a long time, we sat in silence. Then he stood. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just take care of her. Better than I ever did. As he walked to the door, I said quietly, "You know, I once begged you for a family." He paused. "I know. Now I have one. And it was built from the ashes of what you burned." He left without another word. And I stood there, heart heavy, holding the envelope that would change Mia's life forever. That night, when she came home, I sat her down on the porch steps. "Sweetheart," I said, "do you know what it means when someone signs something to say they're letting go?" She nodded slowly. "Kind of." I held her hand. "Your dad signed a paper today. It means he won't be your legal parent anymore. But it doesn't mean you did anything wrong, okay?" She was quiet. "So, what happens to me now?" I smiled gently. "You stay, if you want to." Her eyes welled. "Can I still call you Mom?" I pulled her into my arms. "You always could." That night, she placed the flowers Ryan left into a glass of water by her bed. She didn't say much, but before falling asleep, she whispered, "Maybe I'll write him a letter, even if he never writes back." I kissed her forehead. "That's brave." She called me Mom before he ever called again. The house was quiet. Not heavy quiet, but the kind of peaceful hush that follows a long storm, where even the walls seemed to breathe easier. It had been 3 weeks since Ryan signed the papers. 3 weeks since he chose silence, again. But this time, it wasn't just cowardice. It was surrender. Mia never asked if he called. She didn't mention him at all. Instead, she started talking more about school. About how her math teacher wore mismatched socks. About how her friend Zoe gave her a purple gel pen. She started humming while brushing her teeth. Started sleeping with the door open just a crack. She started smiling without hesitation. And then, one night it happened. Not in a dramatic moment, not during a heart-to-heart. Just in the kitchen. She was coloring. I was rinsing dishes. "Mom, can I have a snack?" The plate slipped from my hand. Not because of the request, but because of the word. "Mom." I turned slowly. She looked up, casual. Then froze. Sorry," she stammered. "I didn't mean—" "No," I whispered. "Don't take it back." My eyes filled. I knelt beside her. "You can call me that, if that's what you want." "You don't need permission." She blinked hard. "It just felt right." I nodded, unable to speak, because no doctor, no diagnosis, no loss had ever taken that word from me completely. And now, from the most unexpected mouth, in the most honest way, I had it back. That night, I tucked her in. She held my hand a little longer. "Do moms ever stop loving their kids?" she asked quietly. "Never," I said without hesitation. "Even if they're scared, or if they don't know how." "Even then." "Even if they leave?" I paused. "Some people leave, sweetie, but love doesn't always leave with them. Sometimes it just gets quiet." She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thanks for staying loud." After she slept, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the family photo she drew last week. Stick figures with wild hair and lopsided smiles. She labeled them me, Bunny, Mom. There was no dad, no erasure, just absence. And for the first time, it didn't feel like something was missing. It felt like something had been made whole. Days passed. Mia kept calling me Mom, soft at first, then stronger, like trying on shoes she thought were too big, until they weren't. One afternoon, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Just 2 words on the back, for Mia. Inside, a single page, handwritten. I recognized the handwriting. "I'm sorry I couldn't be who you needed. I'm sorry for all the times I didn't call, for not knowing how to stay. But I'm glad someone else did. She was always braver than me. You don't have to forgive me, but I hope you never forget that you were loved, even by someone who didn't know how. Love, Dad." I folded it, placed it in a box labeled "When She's Ready." Because some truths aren't urgent. They're just waiting to be handled with love. That evening, as we watered the flowers Ryan once left on the porch, Mia said softly, "You know what I want to be when I grow up?" "What?" "A mom like you, but not scared." He wanted her back, but she chose me. The knock came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I wasn't expecting anyone. Mia was on the floor coloring, humming to herself, a quiet, happy little sound I had grown to crave. When I opened the door and saw him standing there, something inside me went cold. Ryan. Again. But this time he wasn't carrying guilt, or flowers, or papers. He was carrying hope. And it terrified me. "Hi," he said. His voice was careful. "You can't be here," I said sharply. "I talked to the caseworker. She said I'm still allowed visitation, since the termination isn't finalized yet." My jaw clenched. "After you gave her up? After you walked away, now you want to visit?" He looked down. "I made a mistake. She's still my daughter, Clara." Before I could answer, Mia appeared behind me. She peeked around the doorframe, eyes wide, the crayon still in her hand. "Daddy?" His face lit up. "Hi, baby." She didn't run to him, didn't cry. She just stared, then stepped back behind me. "Do you want to see him?" I asked gently. She bit her lip. then looked up at me. Only if you stay. I nodded. Of course. I let him in. He knelt, arms open. I missed you. Mia didn't move. Why didn't you call? She asked. I was confused. I didn't know how to explain things, but I was just waiting. She said it so simply, so clearly, as if she had been practicing it every day in silence. Can we start again? He asked, voice cracking. Can I come visit more? Maybe work towards something better? She tilted her head. You gave me away. He looked like he'd been slapped. I didn't mean to. You thought someone else could love me better. She walked to her drawing, picked up a new color. You were right. I nearly lost my breath. Not from anger, but from awe, from the strength in her voice, the quiet courage of a child who had learned her worth the hard way. Ryan stood slowly. Mia, I want to be part of your life. She turned around. Then why did you leave mine? He had no answer. Because there wasn't one. Not one she hadn't already outgrown. I stepped forward. Ryan, I think it's time you go. He looked at me. Something in his eyes shifted. From hope to realization. You're not just someone who took her in. No, I said softly. I'm her mother. He nodded. Didn't argue. Didn't beg. Just walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned back. Thank you. For loving her when I didn't know how. I closed the door behind him. The silence after was peaceful. Mia kept coloring. Then said, almost to herself, I don't hate him, but I don't miss him either. I sat beside her. She leaned into me. Mom? Yes, sweetheart? Can we make spaghetti tonight? I smiled. We can make anything you want. She grinned. Then spaghetti, with extra cheese. That night, as we twirled pasta on forks, Mia told me her favorite color had changed. It used to be blue, like the blanket he gave me. What is it now? She pointed to the picture on the fridge. Us, holding hands under a rainbow. It's orange now. Like the sunset when I first called you Mom. The day she learned the truth and still said, I love you. She found the box by accident. It was tucked under my bed, labeled Letters for Later. Inside were drawings, a locket, a few childhood photos, and the letter. The one Ryan wrote. I walked into the room and saw her sitting cross-legged on the floor. The letter open in her lap. Her eyes weren't teary, just still. You kept this from me? She asked softly. I nodded. I was waiting until I thought you were ready. And now, I trust you to tell me. She looked down again, read it once more, then held it out to me. You read it to me, please. My throat tightened, but I took the paper. And with a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, I began, I'm sorry I couldn't be who you needed. I'm sorry for all the times I didn't call, for not knowing how to stay. My voice trembled, but Mia was steady. I'm glad someone else did. She was always braver than me. I looked up. Mia was watching me, quiet, still, but not afraid. You don't have to forgive me, but I hope you never forget that you were loved. Even by someone who didn't know how. Love, Dad. Silence. Long, deep. Then Mia asked, was he talking about you? I nodded. Yes. Were you and Daddy together? I sat beside her. A long time ago, before you were born. And he left you? Yes. She was quiet again. Fingers tracing the edge of the letter. Because you couldn't have kids? I swallowed hard. Yes. So, he left you. Then had me with someone else, and then left me too? I couldn't speak. She laid her head on my shoulder. We're the same, she whispered. Both left behind. But we found each other. I wrapped my arms around her. And I would find you again 100 different ways in 100 different lifetimes. She smiled into my sweater, even if I wasn't yours. You are mine, not by blood, but by every other thing that matters. She pulled back, eyes bright, steady. I love you, Mom. And just like that, the weight of every diagnosis, every goodbye, every door Ryan ever closed, lifted. Later that evening, we sat on the porch. She was quiet, but not in a sad way. More thoughtful. Do you think my dad really loved me? She asked. I think he tried, but some people don't know how to love out loud. She nodded. I think you do. I smiled. Sometimes I mess it up. That's okay, she said. You're not perfect. You're just mine. The sun dipped behind the trees. The sky turned soft orange, her new favorite color. She leaned her head against me and whispered, you were always my real mom, even before I called you that. I didn't cry, not because I didn't want to, but because her words filled every space where sadness used to live. Inside the house, her drawing still hung on the fridge. 3 figures, labeled, me, Bunny, Mom. But now there was a 4th, a small heart drawn above the word, found. And maybe that's what we were all this time. Not broken, not lost, not discarded, just waiting to be found. Together. Some people leave scars, others leave lessons. Burn and reborn stories that break you, then rebuild you.